Wyatt-Kowski. I hope I don't mess up your name too bad.
That's not bad.
Peter
Wyatt-Kowski.
Wyatt-Kowski. Okay. Fiji is the
Just
manager of
say
the
Fiji.
Resource Evaluation Section, Water Supply Bureau of the South Florida Water Management in West Palm Beach. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Geology from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Well, this is a thing today. Troy, New York. And a Master of Science degree in Hydrogeology from the University of South Florida, Tampa, Florida. He is a licensed professional geologist in good standing in the state of Florida. He has been with the South Florida Water Management District for over 17 years and currently manages a group of hydrogeologists and engineers charged with conducting groundwater level monitoring, including saltwater intrusion, which we're all anxious to hear about because we're all in that area, hydrogeologic studies, aquifer evaluation, and groundwater modeling to support the SMWMD's water supply mission element. Prior to that, Mr. Wyatt-Kowski was a private consultant for, got that one there, was a private consultant for 11 years, managing and conducting groundwater and resource adjustment projects. Please, let me introduce Mr. Wyatt-Kowski.
Yeah. I just wanted to speed things up a little bit, that's all.
You didn't want to see me mess up your name again, right?
Well, thanks for the invitation, and Isabel, when you call, I'm definitely always here to help. I've known Isabel for a long time. I'm going to address the issue of saltwater intrusion as I understand it today. I'll be happy to answer any questions that we have afterwards. So without further ado. Okay, I'm going to be just providing an overview of saltwater intrusion and the aquifers that are impacted by it. I'm going to cover why is this important to us, some of the engineering and operations strategies that we have, talking about our interface mapping approach at the Water Management District, the results of that effort based on the 2009 and 2014 data, some of the conclusions that we've drawn based on that, and then cover some of the things such as, what can we do about that, and some of the next steps for our subsequent mapping update. So what are some of the common sources of saltwater intrusion? We can get lateral intrusion from the coast. We can get vertical intrusion or upconing from below. So what that means is if you have a pumping well here, not only is the saltwater potentially coming from the coast, but if you're pumping your well too hard, you can induce saltwater intrusion from below. And that's the case where saltwater is at the bottom of the aquifer, and by pumping too hard, you can cause saltwater to move upwards towards your well, which all of the utilities do their best to try to prevent that from happening, and they've done a very good job at that. Next is surface infiltration. Estuaries and boat basins and saltwater marshes, those are all sources of saltwater, and those can actually move laterally inland and cause saltwater to occur into the aquifer. Sorry. And then finally, in some instances, there is ancient or relic seawater that's actually trapped in the low permeability sediments in the aquifer, and that's another potential source of saltwater. Not so much over on this coast, but it's definitely something that's observed over in Fort Myers, Naples area. So, the Biscayne Aquifer, just kind of a 101 or a refresher. It's our freshwater supply source. It's one of the most prolific aquifers in the world. It's, for those geologists out there, it's a calcareous sandstone or limestone. Yeah, I figured that was a small audience. It's thickest along the coast, and it thins to the west towards the Everglades, and it's recharged, or the source of water is from canals and from local rainfall. And just for reference purposes, down here, something called the Upper Floridan Aquifer. That is the alternative water supply source that some utilities have tapped into and will tap into. That is not subject to saltwater intrusion in the traditional sense, but down there the water is brackish quality, which is slightly saline, and the utilities that have tapped into that and will do so, they have to use a different treatment process. It's called reverse osmosis, and that actually removes the salt and renders the water potable. So when we talk about alternative water supply sources in South Florida and elsewhere, at least in our area, that is where utilities and others are tapping into in case they cannot meet their water demands from the traditional source, which is the Biscayne Aquifer.
Madam Chair, did you say from the Florida aquifer?
That's the alternative water supply source.
Using osmosis from,
Reverse osmosis from the upper Florida aquifer, right. For an example,
Hialeah?
Hialeah's got a facility, Miami-Dade, I believe, has some others, Hollywood has a facility, some others like Sunrise and Fort Lauderdale.
Hollywood is always ahead of the rest of us.
I have a question, Ms.
Yes, ma'am.
On the Biscayne aquifer and recharging, I don't know if you're coming up to this later, but I thought, what's the significance of the Everglades flow to the Biscayne aquifer?
That is coming up. It's a couple of slides. So why is this important? Well, the well fields are a major public water supply source of water, and that is a major investment that all the utilities have made to deliver this water, and it's something that needs to be protected. Once the salt water actually enters a well, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to reverse that trend. So whatever we do from a monitoring and a well field management perspective is essential to prevent the salt water from getting into those production or water supply wells in the first place. It is very expensive to relocate well fields, and it's not just the well field, it's the pumps and the piping, and sometimes even to a new water treatment plant. So whatever we can do on our side of things to manage the resources best we can to prevent the need from having to relocate well fields, that's obviously what we're going to do. And I mentioned earlier there are other sources of water that are far more expensive to treat, and the Florida aquifer is one. It requires the reverse osmosis to remove the salt, and therefore, and to make it potable, but it's much more expensive compared to the traditional source, which is the Biscayne aquifer.
Could I ask another question? Sorry. You didn't mention, I'm looking ahead, I don't see it. So we've already had to retire some well fields, right, because of saltwater intrusion. Will you cover that when you show the...
Not necessarily the ones that have been retired. I've heard of certain wells that have been shut down. I'm not as familiar with entire well fields that have been shut down.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you spend a lot of time maintaining where these wells are? Because I've seen some of it, the corrosion, and they, it seems like it could all go into that deep well.
Are you talking about the water supply wells that the
Right.
utilities have?
Right.
Well, the utilities are the ones that actually look, they check on those every day.
But you all don't check on that.
No. I mean, the thing that our agency does is we permit the individual utilities to, they come to us to obtain a water use permit to make sure that their water use meets our three-pronged test of being a reasonable beneficial use and it won't cause adverse impacts and things like that. That's where we do. And then we also use the monitoring data that they provide as a condition of their permit, and we track things like the saltwater intrusion front to make sure that their well field withdrawals are not causing saltwater intrusion to occur.
So somebody doesn't overstate the whole process.
Sure.
That's all I'm asking.
Yes.
This is want to be sure.
So to address your earlier, Commissioner, your earlier question, in terms of recharge, the Water Management District makes water deliveries to the urban areas of the Lower East Coast. The source of that water is obviously rainfall, but from surface water perspective, it's Lake Okeechobee through the water conservation areas, and we have our primary canal system that allows us to convey water from the west to the east. And the important thing there is, we need to maintain the canal levels such that, and that in fact maintains the groundwater levels so that we don't cause saltwater intrusion to occur, or at least minimize that possibility. So this graphic kind of explains in normal water delivery situation in a plan view and a cross section, you can see that here's the freshwater, here are the production wells, and here's the saltwater interface under normal times. And then when there are instances such as water shortages, if we, for whatever reason, we cannot make water deliveries, then the saltwater tends to kind of creep in and moves closer to those wells. And then on the right-hand column, it's, I guess I would call it strategic water delivery. During times like water shortages, what we try to do is identify the geographic areas that might be experiencing more potential for saltwater intrusion than others. And what we'll do there is we'll prioritize the water deliveries to specific canals. So for example, in a typical water shortage, not the entire water management district is experiencing those dry conditions. Sometimes the Kissimmee Basin up near Orlando is dry. Sometimes it's Miami-Dade County that's dry. Sometimes Miami-Dade is dry and Broward is wet, believe it or not. So what we can do is, provide strategic water deliveries so that in the particular areas that might be susceptible to saltwater intrusion more so than others, we can make those surface water deliveries through the canals, try to maintain that fresh water level so that the saltwater intrusion doesn't come in. So what are the factors that affect the position of the interface? I mentioned some of those surface water deliveries, but probably 50 or 60 years ago, some very smart people back then recognized that instead of having canals that were directly connected to the intracoastal or the ocean for that matter, having a surface water control structure was really important, and that would allow us to maintain the surface water canal level, which again allows us to maintain the groundwater level, freshwater groundwater level, so that salt water doesn't just come streaming up the canal network. And so that's the purpose of those water control structures. And they help to maintain those groundwater levels, as I mentioned. Another thing that affects the position of the interface is the public water supply well fields that we talked about. Some of the factors that influence the position there are the well locations, how close they are to that saltwater body, the depths. Obviously, the deeper you are, the more likely you might be able to pull some of that salt water from below, which was the upconing concept we talked about. So shallower the better, further inland the better. The pumping rates, an aquifer has a certain amount of water that it can deliver to you safely. And if you exceed the pumping rate of that safe yield, if you will, you're more likely to potentially cause the interface to move. So when utilities and others come in for water use permits, that's one of the things that we evaluate through groundwater modeling. We'll try to figure out what's a safe rate for those particular wells to operate so that we're not actually inadvertently causing intrusion.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Sorry. If I may, through the chair. Do the pumping stations have sort of governors on them, like a car, which would prohibit the pumping stations from pumping too much groundwater at one time?
Not as smartly as we would like. I think what they do is the utilities have pumps on their wells, and they take water quality samples and analyze them for chlorides, which is the main determinant of salt water. And they do that, I'm pretty sure they probably do that every day from particular wells to make sure that they're not inadvertently causing that. But there isn't an automatic trigger that I'm aware of that would do that. So it's more knuckle dragging approach where a utility will take a water quality sample from a particular well at any given day and measure that chloride level to make sure that they're not inadvertently causing that intrusion to occur.
Is there one time in the season that happens more often than not? Does it happen more in the winter than the summer? Or the dry season?
It's more susceptible during the dry season because what's happening in the dry season is that groundwater levels are declining from at the end of the wet season in September, October, they're pretty high, and then they naturally have a groundwater level recession that goes out through the remainder of the dry season, and then when June rolls around, we get the summer rains and it builds up again. So all things being equal, your susceptibility to saltwater intrusion is most likely happening in the dry season or in the spring.
And if a well gets saltwater intrusion due to somebody pumping too much water, is the cost to move that well, because you have to move it now, is it borne by the person who's doing the pumping?
Most of the areas that have the large pumping are on the utility side of things, so they do that tracking, and if they start seeing a saltwater approaching their production well, they will implement well field operations optimization where they'll cut back the pumping on that particular well to make sure that they don't cause the salt to move in.
We have another question now. Here, one more.
Okay.
I have to sing for a little bit.
Oh, it's not working.
We're all sort of amateur hydrologists here, except we're at the orientation level. passed that a long time ago. Just a couple of simple questions that I, struggling with this issue, have been working in my mind, and I suspect are equally confusing to all this. You show a huge amount of aquifer depth as you reach the bay, is that correct?
It's a couple hundred feet down in my...
Much larger than, upland, right?
Yes, the aquifer is thickest along the coast and it thins westward to the Everglades and eventually...
Aside from the confusion that causes in my mind,
Well, let's go back to
No.
the graphic.
I'm trying to digest that, but I have two other bits of confusion. In Miami, and Commissioner Levine Cava and I are dealing with this on a daily basis in various ways. We know we have a water table that is very close to ground level. Okay, most parts of the day, 8-10 feet at the most, and as you get closer to the bay, typically 2 or 3 feet on. But we use the term above sea level. That's not necessarily the same as the water table, or is it?
It's not, no. There's a standard sea level elevation that's used throughout the country. It's called National Geodetic Vertical Data, NGVD. And
That's the RPI, that's the RPI.
Yeah, that's it. So when water levels are referenced, they reference that, I guess, a mean sea level elevation for all intents and purposes, yes.
All right, I'm still confused, but I'm getting there, and I think...
So one more question, and then we'll let you finish, and then we'll
Yeah, because-
ask questions right now.
Well, I just wanted to thank you through the chair, respond actually to our board member Daubert's comment. We have a situation right now in Miami-Dade where we found some ammonia in the bay, and we think that it's as a result of the extra water. So that's what I wanted in the cooling cans for the Turkey Point power plant. And the idea being that that extra water is pushing down on what was sediment in the canals that included the ammonia and these other indicators that you mentioned, and now pushing them out into both ways, both towards our aquifer and towards the ocean. So it's been detected. We're hopefully going to be discussing this at our board meeting tomorrow. And so even though your point, I think, is, of course, right, you're the expert, that in the dry seasons, and of course, this has been a very wet, dry season, right?
Yes, it has.
And so that extra layer of water, of fresh water, is pushing down, apparently, and the result being some increased intrusion, as I understand.
Yeah, there's a couple of different theories on, and the ammonia issue is actually completely different from what I'm trying to cover today.
Oh, okay.
But
Isn't it one of these? You mentioned 3 things. You said ammonia, phosphorus, and everything. What were the 3?
Chloride?
The 3 elements that you said.
chloride is the main thing that we analyze for in a laboratory to figure out if there is saltwater intrusion or not.
But then you mentioned 2 others, chloride and...
I don't, if I did, I apologize.
Okay.
Okay, so, recognizing that sea level rise and saltwater intrusion has been an issue for South Florida for literally decades. But obviously, things started becoming more acute in the media and elsewhere in terms of the potential impact of sea level rise and its effect on saltwater intrusion. So several years back, our agency decided to start doing some mapping of the saltwater interface in all of our coastal aquifers. I will point that the one exception is Miami-Dade County, and they contract directly with the U.S. Geological Survey to do their work, but the Water Management District does it for all the other coastal aquifers within our district. But what we decided to do was, in 2000, we used the data from 2009, and we then used the data in 2014, and we developed an estimated position of the interface for each one of those times, sort of like a snapshot. And the plan was to, and is to update these maps every 3 to 5 years and use all the available data that we can get our hands on, and to map the furthest inland extent of that interface. And I think we talked about this earlier with your comment, Commissioner, in terms of when is the interface the furthest inland at any given time in the year. And it's typically toward the end of the dry season, again, when the groundwater levels, the fresh groundwater levels are at their lowest, and the saltwater has a greater propensity for actually moving inland. So what we decided to do for the mapping is, we get water quality data from all of our water use permittees on a monthly basis. And what the strategy was to, at the end of the dry season, as best we can, to map the position of the interface. And by doing that every 3 to 5 years, I think we're going to get a really good picture of where the problematic areas are and are not, and where we need to potentially focus increased monitoring or work with utilities to develop some different well field operation strategies to minimize the movement of the interface inland. So fast forward now to we used the 2009 data, and then last year we used the 2014 data. This is a map of Broward County's position of the interface from 2009. And one of the things I want to show you is, and we'll talk about this a little bit, is that, this line there's nothing magic to it. It's an estimation, and sometimes when you look at a line on a map, it's kind of difficult to figure out, what's going on. And so one of the things we also do was kind of plot out. I mentioned chlorides are the parameter that we analyze, and for each individual box here, it's a well, and it's measuring the chlorides versus time. And sometimes that helps you actually see what's going on in an individual area, as opposed to just looking at a line on the map. And I'll go through this in a little bit more detail, but I just wanted to let you know that was sort of our strategy, is plotting out that interface position, but also taking a look at the individual wells to kind of see. Sometimes it allows you to see things that you can't really tell from a map, basically. So I started touching on this. What are some of the mapping challenges? Well, the interface is a three-dimensional surface, and we're only showing it in a 2D map. And it's dynamic, and you're going to see that from some of the subsequent slides here. That interface position is moving all the time. We represent the interface as a single line, but the reality is salt water is constantly flowing, fresh water is flowing, and that they intermingle with each other, and you have a diffuse area instead of this simple representation of a single line. But that's the best we can do. That saltwater intrusion represents data from different pathways. I mentioned, there's lateral intrusion, there's upconing from below, there's some seawater that's trapped in sediments from millions and millions of years ago. There's many different ways that saltwater can exist at any particular location. So sometimes it's challenging to draw the interface when you have some of those things that are going on. And one last thing, and because of things like development, we're actually losing wells all the time. Roads are getting expanded. Some of the wells that we put in 30 years ago in a non-developed rural area are now areas where, we've got 6-lane highways. So every once in a while I'll get a call from the USGS or from others saying, hey, you have a well over here, and guess what? It's right in the middle of an expansion of a highway from DOT, and get rid of it. And, of course I'm thinking, well, I understand that progress needs to be made, but it could be a very important well. And sometimes we'll try to find money to relocate that well. But these are the things that happen all the time. And to develop a really confident position of that interface, we need to maintain that groundwater monitoring network. So this is an example of the baseline mapping. On the left is Broward, and I know Palm Beach is not your jurisdiction, but just to give you an idea of the yellow is the position of the interface in 2009. These things like G56. Can you see this cursor up here? Oh, okay. Well, that's a problem. I've been using this cursor to point out things, and you can't see it. Well, each one of those S and Gs, those are the water control structures that I talked about earlier, and those maintain the canal stages, which maintain the groundwater levels, which tends to impede the movement of the interface. You'll notice, and this is pretty, this is common sense stuff here. You'll notice that the interface is furthest west at like S13. That's because that structure, for whatever reason, when they put that in, put it pretty far inland. And I think had they had the benefit of knowing what we know now, they would have placed it a little bit further inland. But that's the reason that the interface is that far west in the southern portion of the area, for the most part, is because the ability for us to maintain the canal levels is impacted by the location of that salinity control structure at S13 and G54.
Is that S13 west or out? Is that the International Airport to the right?
No, that's actually Broward County. That's
Fort Lauderdale.
That's Hollywood, Lauderdale. Yeah, that's exactly right. North New River Canal is where the G54 is. So again, in hindsight, and then you'll see some others where like G57 is relatively close to the coast, and the interface is much closer to the ocean in that place. So that's one of the things that we certainly learned is, all things being equal, if you were putting in a salinity control structure today, you would move it as close to the coast, as you could. But this is the purpose of the slide, is just to show you this is the baseline mapping that we did based on the 2009 data. So now we've generated maps also for 2014, and one of in 2011, 2012, I made this presentation, and I said, well, where are the problematic areas? And I'm like, I'm not really sure yet, because we've only got the 2009 maps. It's going to be a lot more instructive for us to have the 2014 data plotted out on the same map to really figure out, where some of the problematic areas are. Well, here's the good news, and I know this isn't in your jurisdiction, but the Lantana-Lake Worth area, Lantana did a couple of things. The main thing that they did was they relocated some of the major well field production to the wells that they had further west. And Lake Worth, I mentioned something about the alternative water supply. They put in a Ford and Oxford well field using reverse osmosis, and that supplements their water supply. So with those two things in this particular area, and this is the really good news part of the whole presentation, is the blue is the position of the interface from 2009, and the red is the position of the interface in 2014. And the good news is the interface has retreated towards the coast. And I think it's really instructive as an example to all of us that with well field optimization, there are opportunities for us to stem the tide, pun intended, and actually do things to at least if not maintain, actually have the interface move back toward the coast. And again, if you're having trouble seeing this from the map perspective, the proof is also in the pudding on this chloride versus time graph, where you see the chloride levels were upwards of 1,800 at this particular USGS well, and starting in about 2009 or so, you started seeing that drop in the chloride concentration. So now that it's down probably in the 50 to 60 range. And that's, again, this is a good news story, and it's possible through well field management to see that the interface moves back toward the coast. It's not easy, but it can be done. So that was the good news area. This one's not so bad, but it points out the challenges that we have, and this is in the Pompano Beach, Fort Lauderdale area. The blue, again, is the position of the interface in 2009, and the red is 2014. It looks like it moved a little inland, but again, sometimes the plan view of the map, you can't really see all the different features. On the bottom here is this well G2896, and you can see that the chloride values were less than 1,000 for the most part up until about 2010, and then they started creeping up. So I think that means the interface is moving inland in that location. And you can also see that there are a whole bunch of canals that are connected to the intracoastal there. Those are probably saltwater canals. And again, we talked about the potential pathways for saltwater to move into the aquifer and potentially cause intrusion. The more you have saltwater canals and the further inland you have them, the more susceptible your community is to saltwater intrusion. And that's just a prime example of that. Now, the good news is on the other well to the north of there, we can see that early on, the values were about 100 or so, and then in the mid-1990s, they shot up to about 400 or so. But since that time, the levels have started coming back down. So, again, the interface position from the map view is sometimes it's a snapshot, but by looking at the individual wells coupled with the position of the interface from the map view, you can see that in that particular area, and that's on the south end of the Pompano Beach well field, you can see that I can only presume from well field management, and Pompano has a well field to the west. I think they've been emphasizing that particular well field more so than their well field to the east, and I think they're starting to see the benefits of that by having the chloride values start to come down. So now we're in Miami-Dade, and again, I mentioned that the USGS is contracted through Miami-Dade to have their interface position mapped. One of the things that some of the GIS folks that I have access to, able to plot out the position of the interface from the USGS from 1984 to 2011. And there's a bunch of squiggly, spaghetti-looking lines on this map. The good news is, again, from my perspective, is the interface hasn't really moved all that much in, 30-something years? I mean, there are instances, and I'll get to this, as I finish talking about this, but all of these different colored lines represent the position of the interface from 84 to 2011, and for the most part, we've seen some movement in some areas. Some areas it's actually retreated, some it's advanced. That's just related back to the dynamic position of the interface, but it really hasn't, up to now, changed all that much. Again, looking at it from that regional perspective. And I know we're going to try to touch on this a little bit, but there's definitely some further inland movement in the southern portion of Miami-Dade County. I don't think there's any question that the FPL Turkey Point cooling canal system has had a negative impact on the position of the interface down in that particular area. It's not necessarily, I think there's something related to well field pumpage, there's some things related to sea level rise, a bunch of different factors, but I think clearly in the southern portion of Miami-Dade County, west of the Turkey Point cooling canal system, that has had a major impact of the position of the interface in that particular location. So in 2009, there was a water shortage. We got, especially it impacted Miami-Dade County. We got very little rainfall and groundwater levels were dropping. As we talked about, when the groundwater levels drop, you have a propensity for salt water to start moving up in through the aquifer and into Card Sound Road Canal. And all of a sudden we started seeing chloride values really start shooting up. The good news is in late May in 2009, we got a boatload of rainfall, much like we've been receiving over the last couple of months here. And what I would just like to point out is, for example, that FKS8, it had a chloride value of 14,000 on May 4th. But by June 8th, it had gone down to 10,000. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a huge difference in chloride values to change in the span of a little over a month. And that was all that rain that we got in late May, that tended to flush the salt water that was moving upward, and it kind of returned it back to the level it was before the water shortage. So that's one of the blessings we have of living in South Florida, is that with those heavy rains, we can, Mother Nature is kind of tending to push the salt water back. Other areas of the country don't have that luxury, and they, quite frankly, don't have the volume of water that we get when we get our rainy season.
Is that because there's no salinity control station there?
Well, that is an excellent point. And these graphics were from 2009, but as a condition, I think, of one of their, could have been one of their environmental resource permits, there was a salinity control structure put, I think it's near that FKS4 number. There was a control structure that FPL put on the Card Sound Road Canal, and that is doing the job that the other control structures that I presented in the other graphics to prevent that inland movement of salt water unabated from the saltwater sources towards the Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority well field. So that water control structure again, installed by FPL, is, I believe, now doing the job that probably, arguably, one should have been constructed a long time ago, but there is one there now.
And these salinity control structures are dams. They're
Basically,
they're a dam that lets water in and out.
yes.
You can actually pump water out to the ocean if need be.
That would be a pump station. This is just a control structure that prevents a physical barrier to the salt water moving up, and again, it tends to maintain the surface water level so that, and therefore the groundwater level, so that salt water doesn't move upward. But that's an excellent observation, and it's quite frankly something that probably should have happened a long time ago. But I want to show you that, you know, because of where we are in South Florida, this is a situation where there was a very acute concern about saltwater intrusion in May, but thankfully the rainy season hit and a lot of our concerns were literally washed away. So what can we do? All of us can do a better job of water conservation, you know, at home or elsewhere. Try to reduce the pumpage in our coastal well fields. Prioritize those well field withdrawals if a municipality has a western well field, but then again, we can't pump those western well fields so hard that we're causing impacts to Everglades and other natural systems. Increasing the groundwater recharge, you know, water deliveries from the water management district via canals, the use of reclaimed water, all those things can maintain the groundwater levels, which tends to impact or negatively impact the ability of salt water to move inland. So those are the things that we can do. And then using alternative water supplies. The Florida Aquifer, many of you have heard about the concept of the C51 reservoir as a means of storing surface water and then eventually delivering that water to the south. That's another example of using alternative water supplies and reducing our reliance on the coastal well fields to provide water supply. In the course of the water supply planning effort that the Water Management District does every 5 years, we identified certain utilities that were, quote unquote, at risk. And what that phrase means basically is if a municipality has a well field that's near the interface, they don't have the luxury of having a western well field, and there is no alternative water supply, we term utilities like that at risk. We update those classifications every 5 years. I'm not sure if Dania and Hallandale are going to be in that same situation. I would say from the earlier example, Lake Worth, who put in that alternative water supply, the Florida Aquifer, my guess is, and Montana, they would be removed from that classification because they have an alternative source other than their coastal well field. So, conclusions. From a regional perspective, there aren't major changes in the interface position from 2009 to 2014, and obviously that's a good news story. The interface is dynamic. There is some inland and seaward movement that's observed, but make no mistake, saltwater intrusion is occurring, and what we need to continue to do is maintain our monitoring network and continue to do our mapping exercise to figure out where the problematic areas are so that we can, you know, get ahead of the game and prevent saltwater from actually entering into the production wells, which would render them useless. And again, localized monitoring is going to be required at select well fields to make sure we protect those water supplies. So I said, you know, we update the maps every 3 to 5 years. I'm not sure we would really do a whole lot of good to do it every year. I think if we did it next year, the following year, it might look a little different. I think, you know, stepping back every 3 to 5 years is probably a good frequency to do this kind of mapping and identify the problematic areas. And again, I think we've done that, and I think the news is not as bad as what you might read in the media. There are some areas, certainly the area down at Turkey Point from FPL and South Miami-Dade County is an area of concern. But there are other areas like Lake Worth and Montana where we sort of have a good news story, and we should continue to try to figure out ways to achieve that. Going back to an earlier comment, you know, maintaining those monitor wells, and sometimes we're going to lose them through development and roads getting constructed, but we need to maintain those wells so that we can more accurately develop that interface map and identify areas that are problematic. And that concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Yes, question.
Very good presentation. Let me turn around here so I can see who's asking. It's hard to do it this way. Okay, who is first here? Paul? Please.
You
kind of obliquely referred to the FPNL a couple of times. And one of your last comments was things aren't as bad as you hear in the media. I don't know exactly what you're referring to, but the stories in the last 2 or 3 weeks in the papers have been about Bloom's new FPNL canals intruding salt water into the Homestead area above. And are you saying that that situation is not as dire as it sounds in the newspapers?
No, I am not. I am not saying that.
What is your position on what's happening with FPNL canals?
Well, let me clarify my earlier statement. I don't believe it's doom and gloom in terms of saltwater intrusion from the regional perspective. I think specifically as a result of the cooling canal system of FPL at Turkey Point, that area is, that's the one area that I think merits further discussion and consideration, and I am aware that there was some litigation over the last year, and I'm aware that Miami-Dade Durham has entered into a consent agreement with FPL for them to start doing interim remediation measures, try to prevent the further inland movement of saltwater in that particular area. And I believe that they have a consent agreement in place where they're implementing things like designing and installing a recovery well system so that the salt water that is in the aquifer in that area is going to be pumped out and put down a deep injection well to remove it from, the surface system. And I do believe that those types of measures are going to help the situation down there. I'm not sure it's necessarily going to address the ammonia issue that's been observed, and from what I understand, that ammonia issue is kind of complicated, but just from the saltwater intrusion perspective, I do believe with that consent agreement that things are going to start improving down there just by removing the salt from the system as best as they can.
Just one follow-up. From a geological standpoint, I guess is the word, technical, for us orientation level people that the mayor was talking about, let's just hypothetically assume there was a dire result from nothing else, and I'm just this is totally hypothetical, I'm not assuming anything. And all of a sudden the water supply in that area goes bad, let's say, whatever that means, because of salt water. Is that a localized effect, or is there any kind of domino reach-out effect in other areas, or does it stay in that area, or does it move northward or westward?
Well, knowing that I might get a question about FPL, I happen to have a back pocket slide. The red area is the cooling canal system. The blue line, which is probably very difficult to see, is the position of the interface. And to the west of that blue interface line are certain well fields. I think it's Miami-Dade's Newton well field and the Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority well field. Those are to the west of the position of the current position of the interface. And if there is going to be production wells, water supply wells that serve municipalities, those are the areas that are most susceptible. Now again, I will say that up to now that has not been anything that they have observed at their particular well field. There are monitor wells that are strategically located between their production wells and the position of the interface, and they are tracking that, and they are making sure that if they are starting to see any increase in the chloride values, that the red lights are going to go off in that respect. But to answer your specific question, I think if there is an issue that's going to be observed in that particular area, the well fields that would be potentially susceptible would be Miami-Dade's Newton well field to the south, Homestead, Florida City, and the Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority, just in that particular area.
Is there any kind of contingency planning with we'll sit in some room and think of what would we have to do in case there was a terrible disaster type situation?
Well, that's a good question. Again, I go back to, and I feel like I'm repeating myself 100 times, and if I do, I apologize, but the Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority, they installed some Floridan wells a few years back, and they have a reverse osmosis facility, so if their production wells in the Biscayne Aquifer were compromised as a result of saltwater intrusion, they could switch over and rely more heavily on the Florida aquifer for water supply purposes. I don't think that it has the capacity to meet all their water demands, but it can certainly offset some. And I think, again, I don't want to appear to be gloom and doom. I think the situation in South Miami-Dade County and FPL is serious. I don't want anyone to leave this room thinking that it's not, because it is. But with all the decades of operation of that facility, none of the production wells, the water supply production wells for the municipalities I just mentioned, have been impacted by its operations. But it doesn't diminish the seriousness of the situation, and continued monitoring, and now, you know, remediation measures specifically going to be conducted by FPL. I think I'm hopeful that by implementing those, that the worst of the intrusion in that particular area is what we've experienced, and things are going to start to get better down there as they implement that.
Okay, are you finished, Paul?
Thank you.
Commissioner Kava?
Thank you. Thanks for a great presentation, and certainly answered some questions that I have had from before about how all these things work and work together. And I wanted to bring up about Everglades restoration issues and a little bit more how they impact. And obviously you've given, water moving south as one of the ways that we mitigate this situation. I was in Washington a week or so ago with the 16 County Coalition, which is a group of the counties south of the lake. And one of the things we did was talk with Senator Nelson about legislation he has filed on the House side. Congressman Mario Luis-Villard is the lead sponsor. And the number is, I just lost it, exactly what I want to say about this. It is a bill called Everglades for the Next Generation Act, or something like that. And the general idea is to allow the Everglades restoration projects to proceed sequentially without having to go back constantly for individual allocations, since the whole plan has already been approved.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was very persuaded that this was a very important approach for us, if we could really get that momentum, so that we wouldn't be delayed on implementing the projects as we're able. And, and actually, as a follow-up to that, so I'm interested in your comments about, what will that help us and to what extent? What happened just now, we were going to move some water south with the risk to the overflow of the lake, and, the water goes east and west, but there was going to be some water moved from those conservation areas.
And that's happening.
And what do we think the impact of that will be?
I think it's a beneficial impact, because some areas that have been dry for quite some time are now wet. I think the concern has been the water quality, the 10 parts per billion phosphorus issue.
Right.
And I think on average, we were at 10 or 11, and we need to be at 10. And I think our agency is exposed to having a consent agreement that basically says you will not deliver water any greater than 10.
But we were able to move the water despite that.
True.
Which I don't quite understand, but...
And I'll be the first to say I'm not an expert at that. I believe when we got authorization from the Corps of Engineers and the federal government to do that, I think was with some level of understanding that here's the big picture. We've got giant swaths of the Everglades that are literally drowning. Wildlife are, stuck on tree islands and drowning. The big picture is getting as much water out of the Everglades as possible, and this is the vehicle to do that. But it was certainly in advance of the typical authorizations that one normally gets from the federal government, and I think they understood, the importance and the gravity of the situation.
And then the other is the next project up that we really need support for is the Biscayne Bay Coastal Wetlands Project.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're really hopeful that with your agency's support, we'll be able to move quickly to rehydrate those coastal wetlands and improve the bay quality as well. And just for the information of the group, I'm part of a program on April 9th with Everglades Foundation called Water Summit, and we'll send you the information when we get it. Okay, thank you so very much.
Yes, Commissioner Smart?
I want to just
Please
say
leave us on this one.
thanks briefly. Do I need to use a mic or am I?
I think we can hear you.
Thank you.
I don't know if this one...
Oh, keep that going. Thank you.
Just for you.
All right. I want to thank Isabel for, and you, Madam Chair, for this presentation. I think it was somewhat provoked by my insistence that we look at this issue. At the same time, in my own staff, I have begun an effort to analyze and put in writing, and you've helped a lot, a study of sea level rise as it affects Dade County in particular. A draft will be completed today, which will have to be modified substantially after your explanations. I've also asked my staff to send you, all the board members, an article that came out just this week by Grant Miller and community newspapers that deals with the Turkey Point situation. And if you read the article, you'd almost think that Grant Miller is a hydrologist until you get to the end where he says that he admits that a lot of the information he got from Laura Reynolds from Tropical Audubon. But that article should be in your email boxes. I asked my staff to send it during the meeting. Lastly, I want to say that in Dade County, we are particularly concerned about the reports that indicate that our sea level rise is somewhere between 5 and 10 times the national rate. And that's what my analysis is delving into. I think we have some ideas of what is going on in Dade, but you'll have to read the report before I tell you that. So thank you, and you've elucidated a lot of things. I want to say is, someday I would like to get to the point that I get a PhD in all of this, when I try to figure out how canals tend to impede the movement of the interface. I think I have an idea how that works, but that learned me a PhD in all of this. Thank you.
Lori?
Sure, I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew that the water management, I'm not loud, like family wife.
Just wanted to let everybody know that the district has a Water Resources Advisory Commission, and they meet every month, the first Thursday of the month at 9 a.m., and it is webcast, so you don't physically need to be there, but they cover a lot of these issues, especially pertinent issues of the moment, like all the water we've been having. And this commission is formed to advise the governing board, who then meets the following Thursday. So you can get a lot of really good information from that meeting.
Can you send me the link to that meeting? I'll make sure to.
I have one question.
Yes, ma'am.
The quarterly of cities, we always put together a legislative agenda every year to go to Tallahassee. I've been on the Energy, Environment, and Water Committee. And what's happened is that it seems that all the legislative agenda every year has been about the groundwater and the vegetation in North Florida. But I have yet to see anybody bring forth anything about saltwater intrusion or ask for a legislative agenda for dollars for South Florida. Is there some way that maybe you can guide us? I mean, not go into it today, but I think we should be out there when we're asking for money. We always get voted down, whether it's beach restoration or whatever. But I think we need to spend more time trying to get money to our area. Because I know you've been cut back from the legislature a lot, and it hasn't behooved anybody here, whether it's Dade Broward or Palm Beach County. So I think if you could help us with that for next year with the council, I think it would really benefit all of us here.
I'd be happy to. My assumption is that, when the legislature meets, a lot of the things that we talk about are Everglades restoration related, and that's where the big dollars go. So whatever South Florida is going to get is probably related to Everglades restoration and something like this, perhaps not. And some of those other communities they have challenges with springs and other issues.
You see the brackish water and turning brown. We have the same problems here. But unless we all start going, moving together, and especially with our council, I think we can all really try to make a better effort than what we've been doing.
I'd be happy to help.
Thank you. Well, first, yes.
Thank you. The monitoring stations out by Turkey Point, who are they monitored by and how?
FPL monitors them for the most part.
So they're self-monitoring.
Well, they collect the samples and they send them off to a laboratory, and all the data is sent to the Water Management District, DEP, and Miami-Dade Durham. So, and they are required to follow quality assurance, quality control procedures that are a part of the agreement that we have with FPL. So the Fox is not watching the house. They pay for and collect the monitoring, but we review all that data.
Is there ever, do we ever, either the Saltwater Water Management District or anybody else that goes out and does a secondary test? And
Yes.
how often is that done?
Miami-Dade has actually done that.
And has there ever been a discrepancy? And if so, do you know about how much?
To my knowledge, there has not been a discrepancy, but Miami-Dade Durham has actually done some additional monitoring regarding the ammonia issue, and they also took duplicate samples to make sure that the data that FPL is reporting is consistent with the samples that they analyzed for. So yes, they have.
And then secondly, what are your thoughts on the water that's been discharged from the lake out to the west coast, Fort Myers? Hearing a lot of talk about their beaches being taken over by so-called poisonous water.
Well, I think, and Laura mentioned something about the Water Resources Advisory Commission, and one of the whip-around comments was from a PhD expert, and he was saying, you know, he had been to Lake Okeechobee the week before, was out fishing with his family, and the water quality was better than he's ever seen. So I think, on the lake itself, yeah. And I think there are some issues related to the perceptions of brown water. Certainly it doesn't necessarily look good along on the coast, but those discharges need to be sent to those estuaries right now, and that, unfortunately, that's just the state of having the amount of rainfall that we've received from this El Nino event.
So you're thinking that the color of the water is the issue, not the poisonous of the water?
I don't think there are any poisons in the water. There was mention of red tide, but that's actually a saltwater phenomenon. It's not actually a result of the discharges. There is a brown color. All Florida surface waters have what's called tannins in them.